I bet they can't tell I've been drinking for every one of my reviews. Oh, shoot. Hello, interwebs, and welcome back, because it is time to review another episode of The Orville, New Horizons, this time episode 4, Gently Falling Rain. And sadly, when I say I'm back, I am sadly not back on camera because I am still recovering from surgery. My face is still more puffed up than a krill on whatever the krill eat. So I am still not on camera. You're just getting my audio waveforms for this week, though hopefully I'm hoping maybe next week or the week after I will be back on camera. But for now, let's dive into talking about this episode, because oh boy, this was a great return to form. As many of you know, if you've been following my reviews this season, I've had very polarized views on this season so far. I really enjoyed episode 1, even though I was sort of questioning and having complex feelings about the episode's use of certain topics like suicide, for example, but I still found it to be an interesting look and at least something intriguing to talk about when we came to the review. But then episode 2, I was a bit more middling on. I didn't really think it added anything. And then episode 3, I was very much down on. So when we came into episode 4, I was very curious and almost nervous about what this episode is going to give us, because frankly the quality has been kind of up and down for me personally, though you may differ on that, and that's totally cool. And I was so glad when I got into this episode that this one was a return to what we saw back in episode 1, namely that this episode was very much focusing in on one specific idea and theme, namely a kind of mixed discussion surrounding populist rhetoric, religious orthodox rhetoric, and also tying into very didactically and very directly sort of ideas from the 2016 election, the 2020 election here in the United States, pulling from both of those. And I'll talk about how I feel about the fact that we are pulling from both of those very directly in this episode in just a minute. But also what I loved, despite the fact it focusing in on those themes, that it also, like episode 1, also touched upon a couple different things that play into how this complex web of different topics works together, but didn't distract necessarily from the larger message and topic at hand. And I really appreciated that. Like, for example, we even have a quick little discussion about abortions within this episode, even though it wasn't directly focused upon. I was like, oh, they're bringing that into this, and I actually liked what they portrayed in that moment in terms of how many pro-lifers will often try to emotionally manipulate people who seek abortions. And I thought that that was a really, really interesting thing to kind of add in here. While I don't think it necessarily touched upon it, and as much as it could have been a whole episode for that discussion, I like that it sort of interweaves itself into these discussions. So I really appreciated this episode, and just like episode 1, for just lingering in the morass of it all and kind of touching upon a lot of different things. Let's get into talking about this, because I do have some concerns overall, but I just wanted to start off saying I really appreciated the complexity of this episode, and again, showed me that this season of The Orville is trying to be a little bit more ambitious, even though it's lost some of the more direct humor elements of seasons 1 and 2 that I know some people are lamenting. But for me, it's episodes like this that I'm like, okay, I can get on board if this is what you're giving me, because even if I don't necessarily always love or agree with everything that's being portrayed in the episode, I at least have a lot to talk about here, and I am enjoying that. Oh, also, before we get into the nitty-gritty, I will say I did really love that we got, I think, John Fleck, who many may know as the primary Suliban from Star Trek Enterprise, in this episode as one of the Krill, as well as Bruce Boxleitner from Babylon 5 and Tron as the president of the Union here. That was cool to see, as well as a bunch of other really good actors for the admirals and things like that we've sort of had throughout this series so far. But just those two actors coming in here, I was like, dang, it was nice to see those two, even though they were under heavy prosthesis. Getting into the episode, though, we start off with Taleahs giving a very populist speech to a crowd of Krill, very much using the hatred of the other, the hatred of humanity, in order to drum up her political position within the Krill against current Chancellor Corran's more moderate administration. And very clearly, we're already starting to see a clear evocation of Trumpian politics. I don't think Taleahs is meant to directly evoke Trump necessarily in terms of her attitude and who she is as a person, because she and Trump have very different personalities. But in terms of her rhetoric and how she wields them, she very much is using Trumpist populist politics of otherizing people, and even using religious dogma and things like divine right. Even though Trump played to Christian and Orthodox groups, he wasn't really Christian so much in his wording. But those sort of ideas do fit the Krill, with the Krill is sort of using religious dogma to justify colonialization, expansion, and demonizing others. So I did love to see all those intermingling in here, because that does sort of fit this this sort of rhetoric. Also, I will say that this does remind me a little bit of the first season of Star Trek Discovery Season 1, where you had the character of Takuma also using that same sort of rhetoric about, the Federation will come in and pollute the Klingon blood here, but this being much more set in a very clearly political arena, whereas Takuma was very much more in a religious dogma, almost cultish arena. So two different ideas going on there, but I thought that was sort of an interesting parallel between the two. Then we get a fun little Annie production with multi-species. Thought that was cute, and the Krill sort of misinterpreting it and having some fun with that, and the Admiral sort of like, oh yeah, maybe we should have taken you to see something else. But I did enjoy, again, this sort of discussion of like the treaty, and the Krill administration at the time wants to sign a treaty with humanity because it would be both in their interest to protect them from the Kaylon. I thought that was really good. I also loved cutting over to our Orville crew. We see them doing a pub crawl through history. That's hilarious and totally something you would love to do on a holodeck if you had one. I would totally do that. And then them getting called away to hear from the Admiral that they are going to play a critical role in the negotiation treaty with the Orville coming to the Krill homeworld, which I believe was Delicos was the name. And I just also love the joke that Ed and Kelly were like, the Admiral had no idea that we were drinking. And I love that it's called back to later on with the Admiral. So that was a fun little bit. But then we get a scene with Ed listening to some of Taleah's rhetoric and sort of learning more about her. Again, she has this sort of idea of like, oh, they're going to replace us. They're going to come in and replace our society. Again, this sort of populist rhetoric that is also going into kind of discussions around white replacement theory. This sort of right-wing groups are sort of pushing, alt-right groups push. I thought that was a nice sort of use of that and how she's become sort of a folk hero, again, evoking many populist Trumpian politic figures that we have. Even Ron DeSantis fits this bill in a lot of ways. And I know a lot of you may balk like, oh, you're pulling directly from politics today. The show is meant to be more metaphorical, but they do in this episode when Ed is talking to Kelly, he brings up that they use election misinformation in order to influence the election results with these influence operations, as they call them, which is again very clearly meant to evoke the 2016 election where we saw things like Cambridge Analytica. It's a whole sword story that you can sort of hear about. So it's very clearly meant to evoke that. But I'll talk about this a little bit here. We start to see in a minute that Taleahs sort of has this surprise election that she's elected without anyone really expecting. Again, sort of matching 2016 where many people think Hillary was going to win the election. But then it also mixes it in with a coup attempt because at the same time, while she wins the election, the implication is that there were people in the government that were working to get her elected. Corin even says, oh, this is a coup, which could be read in one way, like, okay, it still fits the 2020 election because Trump did attempt a coup attempt in order to hold on to the government after he had very clearly lost the election. So I think that fits the idea. But there is a subtle implication here that the election results were also fraudulent because of that she didn't actually win those things because people in the government were manipulating things. I don't think it's directly called out. But given a lot of rhetoric used against, like, Biden didn't win the legitimate presidency and the great lie that Trump has been pushing around that there was all this election fraud, to sort of play into that, I am uncomfortable with that. And I also want to make very clear to those of you who may be new to my channel, I am not a Democrat. I'm not a Republican either. I'm very much a leftist. So even further left. I'm on the far left, dang it. So I'm no fan of the Democrats either. But the fact that Biden did rightfully win the election and this episode sort of having that implication, I will say it does make me uncomfortable within this episode. And I will say that the only reason that I am uncomfortable with it is because the episode is so clearly directly pointing to the 2016 and 2020 election. Like, it's not even subtle that it's doing that. So if this was a little bit more metaphorical, I think I would be less uncomfortable with it, but because it's so directly pointing to that, I will say I'm not condemning, I'm not hating on it, but it was something that I was like, there's a reading here that I don't think the writers intended, but it could be there. I'll leave it to the side. I'm not condemning the episode for it, but it was something that did make me uncomfortable. But again, I like that the episode is complex enough for me to have that conversation. Speaks to the episode's, at least, complexity, and I like talking about complex episodes over boring episodes like last week's. Also, I will say, now that we're sort of talking about the Krill homeworld and sort of the group of humans and the Union delegation gets captured, I do really want to say that the production design on the Krill homeworld, beautiful. I know a lot of it was probably CGI, but honestly, when Ed later on is walking around the streets of the Krill homeworld, I was like, damn, this looks great. Like, it looks better than what Disney did for the Obi-Wan show recently, I think in episode 2, where Obi-Wan's sort of running around that one planet there. I'm like, if the Orville is outdoing Disney and Star Wars, that's pretty impressive in my book. I thought that they did a really good job of showcasing that homeworld. The Orville escapes in a fun little action sequence that I think went on a little bit too long. I think that's a problem with this season. Again, just a little bit with pacing. Sometimes the action goes on a tad too long for my liking, but considering they're trying to pad out to an hour instead of 45 minutes, sometimes I do think the action's a little bit overlong, but we do have that sequence. Then we get a great scene with Taleah and Ed. This was so great. I love Ed bringing up Ozymandias, like she's saying, like, you're going to have no mighty works to look upon if you fight humanity and kill our president, because the Kaylon are also going to fight us and have a two-front war. I thought that that was a great point, and I love that the show bringing in these other elements of the larger universe going on to sort of build out the present conflict and the political discussions going on here. I thought that that was really brilliant. And I also like that we get little hints here that Taleah has feelings for Ed when she reveals that she wished that he wasn't part of the delegation that she now has to kill. And obviously, a few minutes later, she tries to get him to go off-world and return him to a ship to repay him for saving her earlier on last season. But I did like that that was sort of subtly evoked here. Then we get a scene with Taleah contacting the Orville to just sort of mess with Kelly for whatever reason, being like, oh, you're getting emotional and all that sort of stuff, and just knowing how to poke her buttons because she did know her. Thought that was a good little moment. But then we get the revelation as Ed's sort of stolen and then kidnapped again. He is revealed that he has a child, Anya, who's this human krill hybrid. And this very much reminded me of the series finale, I guess, of Star Trek Enterprise. And yes, I call it the series finale because let's just forget These Are the Voyages, even though I don't hate These Are the Voyages as much as other people. But I do think Terra Prime was the end of Star Trek Enterprise, and that also had even though it's set on Earth, similar idea of a human Vulcan child that could unify people together and sort of showcase that humanity could be a symbol of something more, that we could become something more. And I like that they had a similar idea here in this show, and Ed's scene with Anya was very sweet and wonderful, and I like that he was caring for her well-being and sort of wondering how she's doing and getting to see that she was very smart. I thought that that was super sweet. I do wonder about the discrimination that she must face on this very, very fundamentalist world that she lives on. She must face a ton of discrimination being half human. So I was also a little bit confused with like this thing like, oh, reveal her to the world, because I'm like, she can't live in this room for her entire life. She has to go out at some point. So I think some people would see her, so they would know that humans and krill can have a baby. But I guess the revelation would be more that Taleah has had the child and that she's the chancellor, so she would end up being a hypocrite. So there is that element of it, but it was just something I was thinking about in the back of my mind. But then Ed goes back to Taleah and him sort of being like, what were you going to do? Like, why did you even have her if you didn't want to acknowledge her or raise her? And we sort of have what I said before, this bringing in this abortion issue. I will say it was a little bit crowbarred in there in the terms of like Ed bringing up like, why did you even have her? Seems like weird rhetoric for him to have used, and I think it was just to get to this abortion discussion here. But like I mentioned before, I do like that they showcased how pro-lifers will sometimes force mothers seeking to get an abortion to see the heartbeat of their child to try and sort of emotionally manipulate them. And we do know that that ultimately traumatizes many people seeking abortion in order to not get the abortion. And it's very manipulative, very messed up, and quite frankly disgusting. And we do see a lot of laws that try to be pushed to try and force that upon someone who wants to get an abortion. It's ultimately very disgusting. And so I was horrified, but I think appropriately so in how it was depicted here. And that would be something that a religious fundamentalist group would do, that they would use for sort of a fox picture of their child to mess with the parents. That is very fucked up, but read true to me. Then we get a giant battle with the Union coming to try to rescue Ed and everybody, but Krill forces saving them right after the president gets stabbed. And then we're brought back to Earth, and I like that the episode ends on a very ambiguous note with Ed saying, like, look, I don't want to reveal my daughter's existence. I want her to have at least as normal a life as she possibly can have, but that peace may be outside of our reach, especially at this worst possible moment, because of Taleah's populist rhetoric and sort of dislike and distrust of humans and demonizations of others. So, to wrap up my thoughts on this episode, like I said, while there are some things that I think make me a little bit uncomfortable, given that the show is very directly calling to modern-day politics, I do really like that it was trying to address those issues. As I've always stated, I will love a show more for wrestling with complexity and taking risks, and also speaking to issues of today, which I think TV shows like The Orville and things like Star Trek need to do. I think that that's what these types of franchises are made for. But I will say it wasn't perfect on that end, but I certainly do appreciate it for it. So, after after 2 episodes that I was sort of more middling to bad on, a nice return to form for this season. I did enjoy this episode, and I look forward very much into episode 5. But I'd love to hear all of your thoughts down below. Don't forget I have my Star Trek Strange New Worlds review coming up in just a little bit as well. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that one. Don't forget to subscribe to my main channel, Jessie Gender. Beyond all that, thank you so much for being here, and I hope that you all live long and prosper.